So my problem with the gray market is the people investing in that market have become so vested in scaling up companies and so unused to asking questions about building good business models that they've created large companies with terrible business models. And that I think is not good for anybody.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Aswath Damodaran. Aswath is a professor of finance at the Stern School of Business at New York University. He teaches corporate finance and valuation courses. His research interests lie in valuation, as well as portfolio management and applied corporate finance. Aswath has received the Stern School of Business Excellence in Teaching Award 9 times, and he was the youngest winner of the university-wide Distinguished Teaching Award in 1990, just 4 years after his arrival at the school. Aswath was profiled in Business Week as one of the top 12 business school professors in the United States in 1994, and that same periodical did a poll in 2011 that named him the most popular business school professor in the country. Aswath has written 12 books, including his latest, The Corporate Lifecycle, Business, Investment, and Management Implications, which was published in August of this year by Portfolio. Much of his book writing begins as an idea and a post on his terrific blog, Musings on Markets, and Aswath's YouTube channel has more than 750,000 followers as well. Aswath Damodaran, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Peter, thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Well, Aswath, I wanted to ask you about the genesis story for the book itself. You, as I mentioned, oftentimes work through the implications and ideas through your blog. Why did it occur to you that corporate life cycles was a topic to pursue in book form?
At the risk of stating the obvious, we're all getting older. And as we get older, we get reminders of what aging brings to us in good ways and bad ways. You're saying, what good ways? I mean, as you age, if you've done your job right, you feel more financially secure. But as you age, there are things you cannot do that you used to be able to do 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the more I look at businesses, the more I recognize the symptoms of aging at businesses as well. And just as human beings do, businesses fight aging. They want to be young again. I describe this, and I've been open about the fact that more money is wasted by companies refusing to act their age than any other collection of actions. And bankers and consultants love it. They're in the ecosystem. They're the plastic surgeons, the physical trainers that tell companies you can be young again. So with that background, I mean, I kind of look at companies, and one of the first things I think about when I look at a company is where would I put this company in terms of its aging. And what makes it complicated, unlike human beings, where you can just ask your chronological age, say, how old are you, and kind of put you into a bucket, companies, you can't do that just based on how long they've been around. So here's how I think about companies going through this process. A startup is like a baby, needs constant care, attention, and capital, with a huge mortality rate. 2/3 of startups don't make it to year 2. A very young company is like a toddler, falls, gets up, falls, doesn't get up sometimes, requires, again, lots of attention. Then you become a teenage company. What do teenage companies do? They do what teenagers do across the world. They get up every day, they look in the mirror and say, I have lots of potential. What can I do today to screw it all up? So teenage companies behave in ways you say, why would you do that? Then you get to the peak of your life where everything you touch turns to gold. All the projects you take deliver great returns. Everybody thinks you're the greatest company ever. Enjoy the moment, because after that comes middle age and then old age. And companies, just like human beings, don't like old age. They try to put it off. But it comes for everyone, no matter how great you're as a company. So the reason I think it's useful to think of where your company falls is everything you do as a company should reflect where you're in the aging cycle. So the whole book is about how should companies approach decision-making based on where they're in aging? And as investors, how should you look at companies based on where they're in the life cycle? And I close it all off by looking at what kinds of people do you want running these companies depending on where in the life cycle. So the entire book is structured around the aging process at companies and how adapting to where you are in the life cycle is the healthiest thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have noted that there's a lot of mythology around what makes a great CEO. The periodicals like Harvard Business Review or Harvard Business School, more generally speaking, McKinsey have held up principles of what makes a great chief executive officer. But you point out that's actually malleable and it differs based upon, for example, what phase of the life cycle that they're in. Can you talk a little bit about your own thought process about the types of leaders that are needed?
When you're a young startup, all you have is vision, right? You got a vision and and you're a storyteller. You're trying to convince people that you have this great product or service. You can't provide them any history. There's nothing there. Young companies need visionaries running the company. They need storytellers. They need charismatic CEOs. As you go towards a business building phase, though, your skill set changes. You need to think about supply chains and manufacturing. Not all visionaries are great at that. And in fact, there is this well known idea of a founder's dilemma, which is there are lots of companies with lots of promise, where the only way the company goes from promise to actual product is for the founder to leave. Because the founder's skill set doesn't allow them to build a business. So you need a business builder. You build a business up, it's all about playing defense. Everybody's coming after your business, a very different skill set. You don't need visionaries, you need defensive players. And then you get into decline, you need somebody who doesn't have an ego, who's okay saying, it's better if my company gets smaller rather than larger. That doesn't come easily to some people. So it needs a very special skill set to run a business in decline. I actually think it's more difficult to find a person to run a company in decline than a company in growth. Everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Everybody wants to grow their businesses. Relatively few people are okay saying, I'm okay making my empire smaller rather than bigger.
There are some few, of course, exceptions to what you've described, and Microsoft certainly seems like one of those exceptions, a company that during the Ballmer years certainly seemed as though it was in decline. And perhaps the plastic surgeon and fitness trainer was Satya Nadella, who was able to come in and actually do some good work on that organization. What do you make of Microsoft and the unusual way in which it has aged?
That's the one redeeming feature of the corporate life cycle. Unlike the human life cycle, where I don't think anybody's found a way to reverse aging or to reincarnate, companies sometimes find that magic pathway to becoming younger again, even if not young again. Microsoft in 2014, Apple in 2000. And let's face it, these are legendary companies. You can go back through time and talk about these companies and what they did to become successful. You know what happens to them? They become case studies. They become case studies at Harvard. Consultants use them. They become the sales pitch you use when you go into a company and say, you can be like Amazon. The problem, though, is when you try to think about all the pieces that came into place to allow these companies to succeed, it's true. Here are the things you'll see. One is you'll see acceptance. The entire process starts with the company accepting that what they're doing right now is going to mean they're going to age faster. One of the reasons I think that Satya Nadella was able to do what Steve Ballmer wasn't is Steve Ballmer was too attached to the old Microsoft. He'd built the company up. To him, Windows and Office were the heart of the company. Nadella had attachments, but they weren't as deep. He was willing to say, Windows and Office are great cash cows, but they're aging. We need to find a new way to grow. So that's the first step. Second, there's usually a change at the top. It's very difficult for the same people running the company to wake up one morning and say, we're going to run the company differently. The third is every one of these success stories, if you look at them, that development came organically. They didn't acquire their way to becoming reincarnated companies, which means companies that look for big acquisitions to kind of recreate youth are almost never going to pull it off. And there's a fourth ingredient, which is they built on skills they already had as a company. Microsoft had some great software engineers. So when it built its cloud business, it could draw on those strengths. It wasn't deviating and going to some business that was unrelated to its core business. But there's a final piece that we all miss. As academics, as consultants, we'd love to send the story out that if you do things right, the way we teach them, you are going to succeed. The truth is, there is this fifth ingredient, which is luck, being at the right place at the right time, that you can never recreate. So in a sense, when you look at successes, that last component is the one thing you can't bottle and recreate. So you can do everything the way Nadella did it and have nothing to show for it. So I think it is true that there are companies that have reincarnated, but it's also true that trying to replicate what they did is not going to deliver the same success.
Very interesting. It's also fascinating some of the examples you draw out. A GE, which had 130 years from birth to its decline. Contrast that with Yahoo, which essentially went 23 years from birth to its ultimate decline as well. You make the point that there are going to be many more Yahoos and fewer GEs in terms of the duration with which an organization can, it can age. And talk a bit about some of the dynamics that are at play that lead to that conclusion from your perspective.
You know what? Business is always full of trade-offs. So whenever somebody says there's an unalloyed good, I'm a skeptic. I say, show me where the bad is because you're refusing to look at it. One of the trade-offs is the question of, do you want to scale up? The answer with every company is yes, of course I want to scale up. Do you want to scale up quickly? The answer in the last 20 years is absolutely. I want to go from nothing to 100 billion in a decade. We created companies that could scale up quickly. And we did that by essentially adopting what I call the Uberization of the word, which is rather than build a business, you build an intermediary. That intermediary, because of technology, can scale up immensely very quickly. But there's a catch. Models that can scale up quickly are difficult to defend at the top. And because they're difficult to defend, because other people can do exactly what you did, you don't last very long at the top. And when you start scaling down, you scale down in hyperspeed. Yahoo went from nothing to 100 billion in 8 years. Went from 100 billion back to nothing in 5 years towards the end of its life. It lasted at the top for 4 years before Google came along, but it's almost built into the business model. In contrast, you take a Ford or a GE, it took decades to build that business. And if you are a VC in those businesses, if you are used to the 21st century ethos, you're probably saying, why can't you scale up quicker? But there is an advantage to businesses where it takes a long time to scale up. You last at the top for a lot longer. And when people come after you, it takes them a lot longer to come after you, and you're going to decline. You can go into decline and last for another 30, 40, 50 years. In a sense, we've traded off those business models for much more short-term business models, and we've got to be okay with it. The companies of the 21st century are going to scale up faster. They're not going to last as long at the top, and they're going to scale down faster. I mean, take a look at the platform we're in, right? Zoom came out of nowhere, right? COVID gave it an assist. Look at how quickly it's grown and become ubiquitous. I'm willing to wager that 10 years from now, if we're doing something like this, Zoom is not going to be the platform we're doing it on because technology evolves. This is a business where there isn't much staying power. In a sense, the 21st century economy is full of businesses like those that scale up quickly, don't last at the top very long, and will scale down fast.
You also make a note that whereas there were CEOs like a Jack Welch, who for more than a generation was this mythical figure, hero, a corporate hero to many, that heroes are going to turn to villains much more rapidly as well because of the rapid growth and expectations that provides, but also the demise to come, as you described. Talk a bit about that, if you would.
In fact, it goes back to a notion of what the right CEO for a company looks like. I mean, if you think about the qualities I described, a visionary, a business builder, a defensive player, and Larry the liquidator, it's very difficult to find one person having all those qualities. If you look at the 20th century company, time took care of that problem. And I prefer the example of Ford. Henry Ford was the perfect CEO for Ford in its growth days. He made automobiles into a mass market business. He was a visionary, but he was also an eccentric. The two seemed to go together. Visionaries are seldom normal people. I mean, the Model T came in one color, black. Why? Because that's what Henry Ford thought every car should be colored. By the time Henry got towards the end of his stint as CEO of Ford, he was outliving his welcome. But he passed on and somebody else took over. The classic 20th century companies, time took care of transitions. But if your company lasts only 20 years from start to finish, I mean, I'm going to take the example of BlackBerry. Those guys who started it were viewed as geniuses in the first 8 years of their existence. They took this startup and they made it ubiquitous. Everybody had a BlackBerry. 10 years later, they were viewed as zeros because they took the same company and they drove it into the ground because they kept trying to do what made them succeed in the first years, even as BlackBerry had a very different business model that needed playing defense on. So I think you're going to see far more friction on management than in the 21st century than the 20th. In a strange way, we've kind of de-weaponized ourselves as shareholders at exactly the time where we need these weapons to move management. What I mean by that is in this century, more and more companies have adopted the Google model of voting and non-voting shares. We've endowed founders with control even without having 51% of the voting rights. And then we wonder why they don't listen to us. So in a strange way, when we need corporate governance the most, we've reduced our capacity to be able to make change at these companies by kind of reducing our powers as shareholders.
Another interesting anecdote, set of anecdotes you have are relative to Walmart. You talk about their purchase of Flipkart, a $21 billion acquisition of an Indian online retailer, as the most expensive facelift in history. Again, an attempt to reverse aging. Talk a bit about that acquisition from your perspective.
In fact, it's good that we talked about Microsoft earlier and the reincarnation there and how it happened. It took time. It was organic. Microsoft built its own cloud business. I mean, and it's not just that Nadella is a genius, he always does this. I think the Activision acquisition, for instance, is a blunder. You pay $70 billion for a company that essentially is already pre-made and comes with a whole set of prompts. I think you're losing the script that made you successful in the first place. But for many companies that are aging and are in a hurry to be young again, you can see why large acquisitions are appealing. It gives them a chance to change overnight. You buy a growth business. In the case of Walmart, they were going after a growing market in India. And somebody tells you, well, look, you can get there by just buying this Indian company. The fact that you're paying a market price up front that already includes the premium you're going to get by being in that country is kind of gets missed. So when you see large acquisitions by aging companies, my initial reaction is this is probably not going to work. And history is on my side. Large acquisitions by aging companies almost never create value for their shareholders because you paid too much of a premium upfront. It's market price plus.
You talk about Starbucks as another company that's in decline, and you don't see a story to bring it back. The issues associated with COVID essentially taking it from Howard Schultz's original vision of this third place between home and the office, and COVID essentially making it a takeout operation,
Right.
kind of destroying that culture. Talk a bit about where Starbucks stands now, please.
It might not be in decline yet, but it's in trouble. It's in trouble because it's lost its storyline. I mean, take the Howard Schultz story for Starbucks. He created a coffee shop atmosphere, environment in a country where there wasn't that, right? This was in Italy. People didn't go to coffee shops and sit around. And he said people like that. So he created these pleasant looking shops, often with Wi-Fi, where you could come and work with your computer. And essentially he said, when people are sitting there, they're going to order food that they probably didn't come in to order in the first place. And it worked really well. Two things happened. One is the market got saturated. I mean, you were at Starbucks every 3 blocks in New York City. The second is COVID happened. Now, COVID, of course, has been the excuse for every company for why things are wrong. In the case of Starbucks, COVID was a particular problem because people couldn't gather in spaces. And they solved that problem very effectively by allowing people to order online and come pick up a Starbucks. But in a strange way, they also sowed the seeds for their storyline breaking. I mean, I tell people, look, the next time you're in a Starbucks, check to see where the crowd is. It's around the online table of people waiting to pick up their Starbucks, not in the store itself where people are sitting around. The notion of Starbucks as a coffee shop has broken. Is it something that can be fixed? We're going to find out because I think they're going to try. But I'm not sure you're going to put the genie in the bottle. You've kind of damaged your storyline. It's difficult to come back from it. Maybe they can recreate a new storyline that if it might not bring them back to growth, but maybe it might get them a little younger again so they can go back to at least the 8% growth or 10% growth they're hoping for. But it's going to be tough to do. When your storyline breaks as a company, it's tough to put that storyline back together. It's not about cutting costs. It's about changing the way you do your business so investors and your own employees understand what you're trying to build as a company.
Mm. I want to talk a bit about Tesla, a company that you've spoken and written an awful lot about and invested in, I should mention as well. You noted it has a great storyline. It created the electric car market. But you've also noted that with Elon Musk, you get his pluses and you get his minuses. The fact that you're currently invested in Tesla must mean you believe the pluses outweigh the minuses. Why is that the fact in your mind?
It's a perfect illustration of what I meant by a corporate teenager, right? I mean, I invest in Tesla with open eyes. This is a company that is going to amaze me with its potential and it's going to infuriate me, frustrate me, because sometimes, or lots of times, it steps on its own storyline. Part of the problem is the person who built the company, amazing visionary, has so many visions that at any point in time, you're not sure. We talk about lost storylines. It's almost like you're not sure what the storyline is. Are you an electric car company, an automated driving company, a battery company, an energy company? And when you get to be $500 billion or $800 billion or $1 trillion, you got to get some focus in your story at some point in time. And every time you think Tesla is getting focus, you get this distraction. So what makes Tesla such an amazing company is it keeps to recreate growth coming from new places. But what makes it frustrating is sometimes those new places get in the way of getting to the places you can much more simply. I mean, Tesla was way ahead of every other player in the game in terms of electric cars. You know? But by allowing itself to get distracted by other places it can go, it maybe has allowed BYD to catch up with it, at least in the Asian market. So Tesla will continue to frustrate me. I still like it as a company. I like it as an investment. But it's not a company where I expect to be able to invest in the company and go to sleep for it. It's not a buy and hold company by any means. You got to accept the fact that you're on a roller coaster and you're okay being on a roller coaster.
Mhm. What are the implications of companies that remain private for much longer than in the past, through to much higher valuations? OpenAI now is, I believe, over $150 billion valuation as a private company, and they're not alone in terms of massive organizations, valuation-wise, who are refusing to go public in the same time horizon as in the past. What do you see? Is that a positive, a negative? Is it qualified in some other way?
By itself, it's a neutral. In a sense, we've created a gray market. I mean, 40 years ago, you had two ways of raising money. You could stay private and raise it from venture capitalists and private investors. We could go public and raise money from public market investors. Over the last 20 years, that gray market in the middle has been created by private investors getting bigger. I mean, VCs 40 years ago, if you had $1 billion, 2 billion, 5 billion, that was a lot of money. Now you have VCs or private investors with tens of billions. SoftBank is a classic example. But you also have public market investors who've intruded into the private market space. If you remember, Fidelity and T. Rowe Price were investors in Uber 5 years before it went public, or 3 years before it went public. So in this gray market, you essentially can stay private without any of the scrutiny that comes with a public company. So the two things you have to worry about is you're allowing companies to become 100 billion, 50 billion, 80 billion as private companies without any of the disclosure and corporate governance checks that come with public companies. But my other problem is the people supplying capital to these companies, and this goes back to my earlier point about scaling, have put scaling up so far up the hierarchy in terms of what companies should be doing, and put business models way down the list in terms of what they want companies to do because they're interested in flipping the company based on its scaled up size, that we've created these monstrously large companies without business models. I mean, I give the example of ride sharing. Ride sharing, I mean, became huge because Uber and Lyft and Didi and Ola, and Grab all raised capital in private markets. They became big without ever thinking about a business model that could consistently deliver money. When Uber and Lyft went public, they were scaled up. They were big companies with terrible business models, unformed business models. So my problem with the gray market is the people investing in that market have become so vested in scaling up companies and so unused to asking questions about building good business models that they've created large companies with terrible business models. And that, I think, is not good for anybody. It's not good for the companies. It's not good for their investors. It's not good for the economy. It's not good for us as consumers, because these large companies can destroy the status quo. Staying with ride sharing, we allowed ride sharing to grow, scale up, and in the process, we destroyed pretty much the taxi cab business in much of the US. But let's say that ride sharing never finds a viable business model. That remains a possible outcome. And let's say Uber and Lyft shut down. What do we do as consumers then? We can't, the taxi cab business doesn't come back overnight. We could be creating these disruptive monsters without an end game that actually serves us as consumers and as an economy. So I think that the gray market by itself doesn't bother me, but the kinds of incentives that went into building companies in that gray market, I think could be troublesome.
And returning to Microsoft again as one example of a company that participates so much in the gray market, OpenAI, who I just mentioned, of course, is a very, very prominent example of that. And you've got scenarios where, they are acquiring a lot of different AI talent, even some competitive ones, it would seem, and all kind of putting this all together into this remarkable cadre of AI talent, as well as AI value, in essence, accruing to them. What do you make of that? Is that net positive, certainly for Microsoft, but it would seem, again, a net negative for the economy?
I think technology companies have always adopted a strategy. For them, acquisition, they don't acquire companies, they acquire technologies. These are options. And the nature of options is for every 100 technologies you acquire, maybe 5 or 7 or 9 will pay off. So one of the problems we have is the selection bias. The ones that pay off, we look and say, that was amazing. But we miss the other investments they made. Microsoft's OpenAI investment, in hindsight, was amazing. But what made it successful was what Microsoft did with OpenAI. I'm convinced that if Microsoft had not acquired a partnership in OpenAI, we wouldn't be where we are in terms of AI as a business, as this word that's driving markets. So Microsoft got lucky, I think, in getting into OpenAI at the right space, but they built on their luck. And that's something to remember. Every business gets lucky. Every company gets lucky. We all get lucky at some point in time as human beings. It's what we do with the luck that separates true success from failure. So I would, I think Microsoft has played the AI game incredibly well. They got lucky at stages, but they built on that luck by taking actions that augmented their success. But I think that's the way technology has always grown. And I don't think of it as a negative, because OpenAI left to its own devices was just it's a lunatic asylum. And you saw that play out last year with the Sam Altman is out, Sam Altman is back. I'm not sure OpenAI left to its own devices would have been able to do any of the things we in hindsight see AI is doing. It's Microsoft that made it happen.
Yeah, very interesting points. I wanted to reflect further on the fact that you've been involved in studying and teaching valuation since the early 1980s. And in the interim 40 plus years, the quantities of data and tools to synthesize the data have grown astronomically. But you've noted that these advances have not made valuations better. And returning to a topic that you've mentioned in a variety of different places, storytelling, which you note that storytelling has gotten worse, and that's actually a key to valuation. Talk a bit about the idea of storytelling in this sort of a setting.
Valuation has become financial modeling, right? If you've ever sat through a banking valuation, there's no valuation. There's an Excel spreadsheet with an Excel ninja driving all the numbers. They take historical data and extrapolate them. A financial model is not a valuation of a company, because when you model numbers out, you lose the business that holds those numbers together. The story is what brings numbers together. Let me give you an example. If you think about the line items in valuation, if I take each line item and I'll let you choose what will happen to the line item, you will pick and choose your way towards getting whatever you want as your value, right? Growth and margins and reinvestment and all the stuff that drives value. But ultimately, these line items don't come out of history. They don't come out of your spreadsheet. They come out of your story for a company. We talked about Starbucks. You can sit there and extrapolate whatever you want about revenue growth and margins, but unless you confront the question of, hey, where's Starbucks going as a business? Are they going to continue this coffee shop theme? Are they going to become increasingly, takeout? In a sense, you could say maybe the end game for Starbucks is forget about all these expensive Starbucks stores where nobody's sitting around. Let's just build takeouts, kiosks. People come in and pick their online stuff. Maybe it's more suited to the Starbucks of the future. That's going to drive your numbers. So one of the things I emphasize in my class, and I actually have a book called Narrative and Numbers precisely about this, is we need to almost teach ourselves storytelling, which actually is difficult because we've created a world where either a number cruncher, you work with Excel, or you're a storyteller, never the twain shall meet. But you need both skills in valuation. You need both sides of your brain working. So I think, when you sit down to value a company, before you open up a spreadsheet and go through the financial data and compute ratios, think about the story for the company. What is your story? And how will that story play out in the key inputs that drive value?
You mentioned three P's that you use to evaluate the strength of a story: possible, plausible, and probable, or probable, excuse me. How do you use this? Talk a little bit about that.
It's easy to fall in love with a story, right? If you tell a story about a company, you're so convinced about your storytelling that you kind of let it ride. I think the person that you have to worry about as an investor, as a manager, the most is you. Because as human beings, we're capable of all kinds of delusions. The 3P test is not just a test for others imposing on you, it's a test you have to run yourself. So once you come up with a story for a company, you got to stop and say, have I fooled myself? Is this a fairy tale? There are fairy tales you fall in love with that you so want to succeed that you stop asking the follow-up questions. I call them runaway stories. The Theranos, the WeWork of the world. But clearly, you look at the story and say, that story doesn't make sense. You wonder, how did these companies get to be as big as they got without somebody asking the question? Because you so want the story to be true, have a happy ending, that you don't ask questions. That's the P test. The plausible, when you tell me a story about a company, I would say, has anybody done something like this before? Because when you tell me a story about a company that's doing something that nobody's ever done, I'm going to start as a skeptic. Maybe you can convince me otherwise. And probable, I'm looking for something tangible I can point to, where the company, at least in a part of the world or in a particular product line, has pulled off what it claims its long-term story is going to be. So with each test, I'm raising the ante to see if, in fact, this is a story I want to build into numbers and eventually put my money behind.
I want to turn to the comparisons of passive investing to active investing. Passive investing has been on the ascent for quite some time, and frankly, the drawbacks of active investing have been laid bare to a much greater extent in recent decades. Aswath, can you talk a bit about the wisdom and drawbacks of each of those as we stand today?
No, to take something away from the table, you got to bring something to the table. This has always been true in every business. And with active investing, if you think about what do you bring to the table that sets you apart, the answer is there are fewer and fewer things you can point to. 40 years ago, if you worked at Fidelity or you worked at an active investing house in New York or a hedge fund, you had access to data that most of the rest of the world did not. You had access to powerful tools that most of the rest of the world did not. I mean, the way I describe this is, we live in a flatter investment world than we ever did. You have access to data. I have access to exactly the same data. You have access to tools. I have access to exactly the same tools. So you think about what active investors bring to the table, those easy ways to bring something to the table are now gone. So the question is, what are you left with? You got to come up with something, if not unique, that's rare. What could something rare be? Well, it could be a really long time horizon. I'm convinced that one of the biggest advantages that Warren Buffett has had with Berkshire Hathaway, he was investing in insurance company capital. The nice thing about insurance company capital is it doesn't panic. So you can have a time horizon that doesn't match the rest of the market. It's the reason he could buy Goldman Sachs and Bank of America in November of 2008, when everybody else was stepping and said, why would you touch that stock? So it could be that you have a longer time horizon than the typical investor. Warren Buffett has it, but think about your average active mutual fund manager. His time horizon doesn't matter. Her time horizon doesn't matter. Your time horizon is only as long as your shortest term clients. So 95% of active mutual funds don't have a time horizon advantage. It could be that you have a tax advantage. You're a tax exempt investor in a world full of taxable investors. Again, that's a limited advantage. There are lots of other tax exempt investors competing for the same stocks. So the problem with active investing is as you look around, say, what is it that you're bringing that's unique and different? There are fewer and fewer things you can point to. So forget about the data, which is already negative about active investing. Philosophically, you could make the argument that the payoff to active investing is less than it used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago. And then you add two other developments. One is in the 1960s, we invested in a mutual fund. You know how often you monitored it? You didn't have any cell phones. The Wall Street Journal probably didn't carry fund data. Once a year, maybe once every 3 months, if you were lucky, you got a letter from the mutual fund saying, a statement saying, this is what your mutual fund holding did in the last 3 months, with no comparisons. So you made 11% return. You felt pretty good about that. I made 11%. The fact that the market was up 18% kind of slipped by you because there were no comparisons that you could make directly. So first changes, those days are done. Active investing has always had trouble. But now that trouble is transparent. Everybody can see that their investment in whatever fund they've chosen is lagging the market. The second is in the 1960s, if you didn't like the way your mutual fund was performing, you know what you had to do? You had to take your money out of the mutual fund and put it into another mutual fund that was doing just as badly. I think the greatest disruption in financial markets was actually Jack Bogle's Vanguard Index Fund because it gave people a choice. And of course, those choices are proliferated. Now you can have ETFs, you can create indices of pretty much everything, invest in them directly, passively, and get whatever asset allocation mix you wanted in your index fund choices. So the information is there and your choices are easier to make. Why are we surprised that so much money is leaving active investing? In fact, the question is, why isn't it happening even faster? Because this is not something that active investing is going to be able to solve. It's a long-term drip where each year they're going to look at their market share and it's going to be lower than it was the year before. But here's the optimistic front. I don't think active investing is going to go down to a 0% market share. There's an old tension. For markets to be reasonably efficient, people have to think they're completely inefficient. Because we all woke up one day and say, hey, there's no point trying to pick stocks. Then we have a market that's completely noisy and random. So I think there will be a steady state where active investing, rather than even a steady state, there'll be an ebb and a flow, but there'll be a floor for active investing below which it won't drop and a ceiling above which it can't go. But that steady state is going to be about half the size of active investing today, which is not great news if you're a portfolio manager or somebody involving the active investing business, because it means your business is going to shrink. Talk about aging. Every large active investing firm is an aging business. Most of them have to accept that and retool and say, how do we deal with aging? But maybe a few of them will be able to break out, like Microsoft, and come up with some creative way of being a success in the active investing world of the future.
And why have you chosen to become an active investor in light of all you just said?
Because I enjoy active investing. I mean, I don't walk in expecting to beat the market. In fact, I'm perfectly okay. I tell people, look, at the age of 85, you came to me and said, over your 60 years picking stocks, the intrinsic valuation model, you underperformed the market by 20 basis points. You could have done better by just buying an index fund. I'd be perfectly okay with that because I've enjoyed the process. Would I be okay underperforming the market by 5%? No. And that's why in active investing, my rule is do no harm. Don't make choices that can have consequences that leave you lagging the market by 4, 5, 6%. It's one reason why I've never been a believer in concentrating your portfolio in 3 or 4 or 5 great companies. You might be right, but if you're wrong, the consequences of being wrong are much more deadly. So don't sacrifice spreading your bets just because you want to pick stocks. There are 46,000 plus stocks in the world. Don't tell me that you can find only 5 stocks that meet your criteria. You got to spread your net wider. So to me, I follow the Hippocratic Oath in active investing, which is I try to do as little harm to myself as possible. Because as a human being, you will tend to overreach.
A fascinating detail I've learned from you, Aswath, is that if you miss the top 50 stocks in the market historically, the rest of the stocks underperform treasuries. So it's always been that true that the biggest winners carry the market to a great extent, something that is really focused on in recent years with the FANG-AM and the Mag 7, for example. But you note that what's different is in the last decade and a half, it's the winners are the same companies. So typically there's an evolution as to who those top 50 are. Now it's concentrated to a much greater extent. Can you talk a bit about the broader implications of this?
I think it's a reflection of business economics, which is, we have more and more businesses where consolidation and winner take all economics win. I mean, as an example, if you looked at advertising 30 years ago, it was a splintered business. Why? Because it was localized. The New York Times had a market, the Washington Post had a market, the Los Angeles Times had a market, billboards had a market. Then along came online advertising. Online advertising lends itself to consolidation. Why? Because you want to be where everybody else is. Google and Facebook control the online advertising market because that's where everybody else is. I mean, you can complain about it, you can threaten to break them up, but consolidation is where the business is going because of the way it's been restructured. Car service 20 years ago was incredibly splintered. The largest taxi cab company in the market was probably 0.1% of the overall market. Then along came ride sharing. You've created the economics. Same thing with Airbnb and hospitality. So this is, I think, when you look at winner take all economics, you're going to have winner take all markets. And that does create an issue for active investing because in active investing, you pick and choose stocks. You're saying, so what? If you're lucky enough to pick and choose a winner, well, all the more power to you. Your portfolio is going to do amazingly well. But if your picking and choosing leads you away from those winners, you're going to have a really tough time getting close to the market. If you did not own any of the FANG-AM stocks in the last decade or the Mag 7 stocks in this decade, I don't see how you would have been able to beat the market over an extended period. You put yourself at such an... So the argument for passive investing gets even stronger because that way you're going to get the winners, not because you were trying, but because they're part of the index you invested in. So I think that it raises the ante for active investors, that they need an investment philosophy that at least gives them a chance to get these winners in the portfolio. So if you describe your investment philosophy and it leads me to believe that you're never going to be able to pick these winners because of criteria you put in there, then I'm worried about you as an active investor. One of the reasons I've been a little harsh with traditional value investing, the Ben Graham route, because while it worked in the 20th century, I am worried about the consequences of adopting that philosophy in the 21st century, because almost by design, you will never pick the next Mag 7 stock because you put in criteria that's going to lead you towards a mature phase of the life cycle. And you need some young growth companies in there to balance out your portfolio because that's where the next big winners are going to be.
And indeed, Ben Graham's most famous acolyte, Warren Buffett, has a lot of his performance in recent years has been due to an Apple investment, right? So in some ways, laying out what you're describing.
And I think, and Buffett, I think, has been much more open about this than most value investors. He said, look, if you're starting today, you're probably better off buying an index fund. This is coming from the greatest value investor of all time. And he's been open about the fact that his biggest drawback in his investment philosophy was that he did not have any tech companies in his portfolio through the bulk of the tech boom. Remember, by the time he bought Apple, it was a classic value stock. So he didn't buy Apple because it was a growth company. He bought it because it was a value stock. So, you missed the great years of Apple. It's been a great investment since, but you missed some of the great years of Apple because of that constraint you put in. So I think we all need to be open with ourselves about the limits of what our investment philosophy exposes us to. And then think about building in enough of a buffer that we don't get taken down by those limitations.
Not so surprisingly, most of the top market cap companies are members of the FANG Am and Mag 7. How do you explain a company like Eli Lilly, which I believe currently sits at above $850 billion in terms of its market cap?
It's driven its incredible success in the last 3 or 4 years. Our fight against obesity is much more important to us than a fight against diabetes. Eli Lilly has managed to get on that bandwagon. And if you look at the top 10 drugs for obesity, in addition to the Wegovys and the Ozempics, many of those drugs are coming from Eli Lilly. So in fact, talk about reincarnations. This might be a reincarnation that you put up there. Is just like Microsoft found its new success with the cloud business, Eli Lilly might be finding a new anti-aging drug by going after the obesity market.
Yeah, fascinating. I want to talk a bit about your career. When you went to UCLA and got your MBA, eventually your PhD, was your intent always to be a professor? You were going into a field, studying a field that is tailor-made to go to Wall Street and to reap the many rewards of doing so. You made it to New York, but you chose the academic pathway. Why was that?
I'll make a confession. I never wanted to be a professor, a researcher, a banker. I wanted to be a teacher. I'm first and foremost a teacher. I describe myself as a teacher. And I'm open about the fact that there are far more brilliant people out there doing heavy research. It's not for me. I'm a teacher first and foremost. And everything I've done in my lifetime, my writing, my talking, my YouTube videos has been an advancement of teaching. I've never consulted a day in my life, and I've never regretted not consulting. I don't do expert witness work. So I'm a teacher. I enjoy teaching. I love teaching. I come from a family of teachers. My wife is a fifth grade teacher. My daughter is a kindergarten teacher. My daughter-in-law is a high school chemistry teacher. And I think their jobs are a lot more difficult than mine. I enjoy myself teaching because I teach a few hours a week. They teach, every day, 7 hours a day. So I am blessed in terms of being able to teach without having to worry about burning out. So from the day I stepped into that PhD program, my end game was I wanted to teach, and the PhD was for me a pathway to be able to teach in the most pleasant circumstances I could. 30 weeks a year, 4.5 hours a week. I mean, you can't ask for a much better teaching assignment. So to me, it's always been about teaching, And so if people ask me, why did you teach valuation? Because it happened to be something that brought together things I was interested in. But if I wasn't teaching valuation, I'd be teaching algebra. I'd be teaching English. I'd be teaching something. That to me would always be where I'd end up, no matter what pathway I adopted. So that's always been, for me, what this game has been about.
I mentioned in the introduction the many accolades you've gotten that certainly prove you are not just a teacher, but a great one. I wonder, as you reflect on your own experience and perhaps not forcing a modesty, great teachers who influenced you, what makes a great teacher?
No, I've had great teachers who were, I mean, who had followed the John Houseman. I mean, people that probably don't even remember, but John Houseman in the Harvard Law, where basically he was this imperious figure up front and effectively a great teacher because you looked up to that. I wasn't that kind of model. So for me, great teachers come in all kinds of packages. The one thing they all share is they all love what they teach. It's difficult to teach something if you don't enjoy the subject yourself. And second, you want to share that joy with the people that you're teaching. Now, to me, teaching is always an expedition where I tell them, look how much I enjoy valuation. I want you to enjoy it as much as I do. Because if you enjoy something, you're going to learn it. I mean, human beings naturally want to learn. I think, unfortunately, the way we design education systems is we take the joy out of the system. And we take the joy out, education becomes a grind. So to me, teaching is about sharing joy and sharing what I enjoyed, and also giving people, the process of thinking, because I can't teach them answers because my answers are going to get outdated the day they walk out of my classroom. I want them to get a window into how I think through answers to questions and hopefully be able to do it for themselves.
You've also lamented the fact that we don't have long periods of inactivity. If we're waiting in line for a flight or we are waiting in line in the grocery store, rather than being lost in our thoughts, we pull out our phone and start to read something. Talk a bit about your worry associated with that. What is lost as a result of our not having that time for deeper contemplation?
I think some of the most interesting things we come up with happen because we have an idle mind. Go back in time, Newton is sitting under an apple tree, an apple falls on his head. If he was looking at his iPhone, he probably would have cursed the apple, thrown it to the side, and gone back to his iPhone. But instead, he made these leaps of faith, and this is what makes human beings amazing. And he comes up the laws of gravity. Archimedes is sitting in his bathtub, notices the amount of watering is displacing his base. In a sense, it's the great discoveries of over time have come from people kind of pondering things and making connections that by themselves look unrelated, but connecting them in our mind. I think one of the problems with the times we live in is we're filling in every free moment of every day with something to do. People often ask me, what should I read next? And I say, look, maybe you should read less and think more. Because it's so easy to read up an answer to a question rather than reason your way to an answer. So I think we need to give our minds a chance to exercise, because that's what happens when you have an idle mind, you start making connections, you're letting that muscle play out. And that muscle is getting flabbier and flabbier because of the way we surround ourselves with things to do and technology that fills in the gap. And I'm afraid we're setting ourselves up for, I've talked about AI and the threat it might pose to you and I in terms of what we do. We're actually making it easier for a bot to replace us rather than more difficult.
One way in which we might make it easier for a bot to replace us is to have most of our professional contribution publicly available through YouTube and blogs and so forth, as you do. I wonder, obviously, your decision to do so came well before artificial intelligence could synthesize all of that. And I want to get momentarily into the Damodaran bot that a friend of yours built. But I want to ask you, why did you determine that you would have such a public version of all of your thoughts, your writing? Why do it in that manner as opposed to being behind paywalls or not being available at all except to your students?
I kind of gave away the game and I said, I'm a teacher. If you're a teacher, when people ask me, why do you share all the data? Why do you put it all? I said, if you ever walk by a Jehovah's Witness, right? Jehovah's Witnesses are very polite. They hand you a Bible. So why do you think they do it? Is it because they get paid? They get commissions? No, they do it because they get salvation, right? I think of sharing my data, my teaching the same way. I'm teaching. I'd rather teach an audience of 10,000 people rather than 100 people. I'm doing the work anyway. So if you're a teacher, it almost goes against the grain to not share. A teacher who kind of holds on to stuff saying this is secretive, it's not at the core of teaching. The nature of teaching is sharing. That said, though, it is true that by sharing everything, I'm setting myself up to be replicated and replaced. But here's why I'm okay with it. I know one strategy people can adopt to avoid getting replaced is to be secretive, to take what they do and say, I'm going to hide what I do, because if nobody knows what I do, how will they replace me? The problem is I don't need to see what you do if I can see what your actions are, because I can reverse engineer from that secret formula that allowed you to do what you did. I'll give the example of active investing. You can, as an active investor, have this secretive formula, right? You might not ever let me even get close to it. You might hide it in the 28th floor of your building behind 3 security guards. But you know what? Every time you act, you buy something, you sell something, I'm observing your actions. And by observing your actions, I can reverse engineer what that secret formula is. So if AI works out as people think it will be able to reverse engineer from what you do, what your secret formula are. It's almost a hopeless task to keep it secret. So I might as well just give it away and see if I can stay at least one step ahead of that replacement that might take everything I've done and say, I can do it as well.
We'll talk about your replacement and your the fact that, unbeknownst to you, a friend of yours put together this Damodaran bot. What's your reaction to that?
No, I knew it was coming because he was the first one to call it a Damodaran bot, but I know there are at least a half a dozen people who've taken the stuff that I do and say essentially, but because, he's somebody who's well-versed in machine learning. So when he said that, I knew this was serious, that he was actually going to feed that AI entity everything I've ever written and done, and essentially see if it can then replicate. Can it write a post based on having read 2,000 pages of posts? And I have to start with the presumption that it eventually can. Right now, it's still young, it's still forming, it might not be able to do it, but eventually I have to assume that it will get there. And here's why it goes back to, what's called, Pascal, this famous French mathematician, came up with what is famous gamble, where he started raise the question, do you believe in God? And then he put up a matrix where he said, God either exists or he doesn't. And you either believe that God exists or God doesn't. And then he played out what the payoff is in each box. So if you believe that God exists and he exists, you get heaven. If you believe that God exists and he doesn't, you have to behave well. So, but you really didn't pay much of a price. And if you don't believe God exists and he actually happens to exist, you get hell. And he said, given the payoff, even if God doesn't exist, it makes sense for you to act like he does. I would say with AI, I'm going to adopt the same strategy. Maybe this whole hoopla about AI is overdone. Maybe there will never be bots that actually do what we do. But it behooves me to act like it will and ask myself, what can I do to stay ahead of my bot? So this bot has read everything that I've ever written. So it actually remembers what I've written better than I do, because I don't remember what I wrote 10 years ago. It's looked at every evaluation I've done. It looked at every YouTube video that I've ever put out there. And I have, I think, 1,300 videos, every class I've taught. It knows in terms of content everything I've done. And my task, if I choose to take it on, is what can I do to get ahead of my bot? And in a sense, that is what I wrote about. What can I do? What that is going to be difficult to replicate. I don't have the answer, but I have to keep trying. I have to have an empty mind. I have to make this because AI is going to have a tougher time doing things like reason away to an answer, connect these unconnected thoughts. Put simply, it's our humanity that gives us an advantage over AI. And we've got to rediscover it, because I think over the last 10 or 20 years, it's almost, if you were a believer in conspiracy theories, it's almost like the technology companies have given us products that make us less human. And by doing so, they're setting us up to be replaced. That's a conspiracy theory. But I think we've got to fight back and reclaim that humanity, because that's what's going to give us that advantage.
Well, given the transparency of your thought process and your idle mind, I look forward to learning what you learn as time goes on. And Aswath Damodaran, I'm so grateful to have spent the past hour with you. Thank you for being so generous with your time and, more importantly, with your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Well, good. What a, again, pleasure to spend some time with you. I really appreciate you doing so, and I hope it's not the last time we have a chance to chat.
Thank you. I really, I look forward to the next time we can chat.